Hello everyone, I'm just getting ready here. I ran a bit late with the meeting, so let me just set things up real quick. So welcome everybody. Let me just shut this down. There we go. So welcome everyone to today's session. I'll have to unfortunately make it pretty quick, but maybe that's a good thing when we're talking about COVID-19, since I'm sure the vast majority of you have probably heard, 10 lifetimes worth of information and what have you about COVID, and you're probably fed up with it. Nonetheless, we have to discuss it at least a little bit, just because unfortunately it is, like it or not, it is the reality we're currently living in, and most likely going to be living in for the short to medium term, at the very least. Now, exactly, who's right about the stats and whatnot, again, we'll discuss about that very, very briefly. Let me just turn off that. Yeah, sorry, there we go. Okay, thank you for pointing that out. Had forgotten to turn off the music. There you go. So as I was saying, welcome everyone. So today we will be talking about a few statistics in terms of what are some credible projection models in terms of how COVID has spread from in the last few months. How will it be going forward? What are going to be some of the economic impacts of COVID? What have some of those economic impacts already been? Most of the stuff you already know. So I'll just be kind of looking at kind of the broad market, if you will, and the main issues that affect individuals and are likely to affect more people going forward. All right, so without further ado, let's very quickly talk about modeling when it comes to exponential growth curves. If you're looking at anything, whether it's investment returns, whether it's in this case the progression of a pandemic, it is incredibly difficult to forecast things accurately long term. Short term, you can be fairly certain or fairly confident if you have a decent model that the model will be pretty good. So this specific model here, for those of you that were around back in March when I was talking about this, so this particular image here is actually from. So I had given this forecast, I think it was on March 26th, and I had forecast the next like 7 to 10 days or so. And in orange, you see my original forecast model, and in red are the total numbers of confirmed COVID cases in Canada that subsequently showed up. So that particular model was ridiculously effective at forecasting. So this is not just to tap myself on the shoulders and say, oh my God, I did such a good job. Because again, short term, it's fairly simple to forecast things 1-2 weeks ahead of time. The really tricky part is to forecast it long term, and the main reason for this is, as I described it in a session when I was talking about exponential growth, is that even if you have something like 0.2%, 0.1%, or even 0.01% difference in reported cases or in confirmed cases from one day to the next, that obviously impacts the growth rate of everything afterwards. So you can very easily, very quickly shift from this. So here's my original model. This is basically the orange one. Every single one of the black dots are basically days on which the model had already been readjusted. So all of this I had forecasted back at the end of March, beginning of April. Now, obviously, if you're looking at it with the real numbers right now, so the real numbers right now are quite a bit different. And again, I'll show you a bit more data afterwards. So obviously right now we're in Canada roughly 135,000 or thereabouts. If you're looking at the stats from Wikipedia, I think they say 134,000. If you look at the stats from Johns Hopkins, I think they estimate about 136,000. So right around 135,000 individuals. So in reality, we're about here. And again, I'll show you this afterwards. So basically this kind of went on to be something along these lines, roughly. It was a bit off there, something like this, I think. So these are, again, total number of cases. So why do we care about this? Well, again, this orange model that I had here, this was my original forecast, and this was assuming that we can pretty much test and catch every single case. Obviously, that's not reality. It's impossible to be able to test every single individual that has been exposed, especially people that are asymptomatic or that might be in areas where it is difficult to get tested. And again, if you have very, very low symptoms, for instance, back in early March, I had a bit of a headache and a runny nose and some muscle aches for like 1 or 2 days, and then it went away. Had it persisted for a few more days, I would have gotten tested just because of the muscle aches, the headache, and the runny nose. That's nothing. So most likely that was just a simple, cold. But I don't know. I've never gotten tested, and afterwards, but out of precaution, I basically isolated and quarantined myself for 14 days, because at that point, again, no one would test me for just those very basic symptoms. But who knows? Maybe I actually had COVID-19. I don't know. No one knows, right? So the point is, just because this particular model is roughly 4 times higher than the recorded numbers right here, doesn't necessarily mean that that's not closer to real numbers. So anyway, the point there is, what's interesting is that now the growth rate higher up, in the higher up portions here, are actually quite similar to the current actual rates. Why does this matter, right? Why this matters, again, the second model was another one that after a bit more information came in, I had adjusted it a couple of weeks or a week or so later, and you can see that one was closer to reality here. But obviously, the earlier, the later on you adjusted, from that initial very high exponential growth rate to still an exponential growth rate, but a much lower exponential growth rate later on, the model will be a lot closer to the real numbers right now. So if I was to readjust it for the model with current data, then I would be able to forecast something that is probably a lot closer to this. But anyway, so the take home from all of this is it's incredibly difficult for anyone to really forecast this accurately, but realistically speaking, based on roughly how many tests we're doing versus how many people are likely confirmed, it's not unreasonable to have kind of a midpoint estimate of roughly 4 times as many Canadians having already contracted COVID-19 than are actually being reported, because that's just the number of people that we're able to actually test on a reliable, continuous basis. So now the reason I brought this up is because keeping the exact same original model, and as I said, this is likely not a super conservative one. It's probably mid-range. There are other models that I've seen in the media that showed much more potential, many more potential cases than this many. So according to this model, right now we would be at roughly 600,000 individuals or so. Whereas again, right now we are only about at a quarter of that, or barely not even a quarter, in terms of confirmed cases. But in terms of actual cases, I wouldn't be surprised if this model is actually on the conservative side, and in reality, we are probably like 5 times as many or even more. So why do we care about this? Because obviously these are total cases. They're not concurrently active cases in Canada. It does matter though, because depending on how many reported cases you have, it does impact that small percentage, yet a very important percentage to keep in mind, that the death toll, right, which is in Canada is, again, depending on which sub-region you're looking at, is between about 5 and about 9%, which is quite high if you think about it in terms of number of deaths versus number of cases. So that doesn't sound great, depending on, again, which province you're looking at. Some are worse, some are a bit better. So all of these are things to keep in mind, because every single life lost is important. And the more we can avoid that, the better off people will be at the end of the day. So this is not to scaremonger. This is not to say there's so many people that will be infected and oh my God, we have to panic. No, There's no point in panicking. You have to just look at this realistically. How easy is it to control this virus, and what are the economic repercussions? That's the whole point of today's session. It's not to try to bore you to death with statistics, but really, what are the economic repercussions when you have to, not necessarily shut down the entire economy. Hopefully we don't have to go back to shutting down a significant portion of the economy, but it is incredibly likely that we will see, individual companies, schools, classrooms, maybe. In certain cases, you might see an entire city or a small town being under semi-lockdown, semi-quarantine, again, at least for a few weeks or a month or so, if things get out of hand. And the problem is, with every single individual that feels their personal rights violated whenever they're being asked to wear a mask in public, it becomes that much harder to track and to make sure that people don't, give each other COVID-19. So that being said, let's look at some of the financial impacts of COVID. And again, I'll come back to the statistics, the likely projections, and how things will look like roughly, in March. So basically about 6 months from now. And speaking of March, I don't know if you read the description to today's session. By the way, I just realized that I forgot to include the links I'll be using. So I'll be copying them in the chat instead, and I'll put them in the description of the video at the end of this. Again, my meeting was supposed to end half an hour ago. A bit running late today. So COVID-19 financial impacts. So obviously, I've covered this before, and I'm sure you've seen it. So obviously, people might be impacted and have been impacted to the point of, well, if they had a startup, they might have had to shut down their startup. If they were in the hospitality or service sector, depending on what services they were providing. For instance, if they owned a restaurant, many restaurants are not able to be profitable and operate only at 50% or 70% capacity. They need to be much, much busier than that to be profitable. So in many instances, because of the various measures that have been put in place, a significant portion of companies, unfortunately, of small medium enterprises, had to shut down, and as a result, either have already declared bankruptcy or are on the verge thereof. So as a result, people will have to either, start a new business or acquire new skills, at least in a transient fashion, until we get either a vaccine or some other form of treatment that helps us better deal with the symptoms, better address the fallout of COVID-19. How far away will that be? Well, again, it really depends. I'm sure you might have heard yesterday, AstraZeneca was mentioning that they actually had to put their most promising vaccine trial on hold. Again, different companies will have sometimes multiple. They'll run multiple vaccine trials. So AstraZeneca, their most promising one, they actually had to put it on hold temporarily because one person had developed a significant complication. So it was something along the lines of, I believe it was a inflammation of this along the spinal cord or the nervous system. And you want to make sure that if you do get a vaccine that is effective, so efficacy is how good is this vaccine at impacting and protecting people against catching the full-blown, whatever it is that you're vaccinating against, in this case, COVID-19. You might catch a milder version of it or not, or don't catch it at all if it's effective. But at the same time, do you really want to have a vaccine that is that effective but risks paralyzing you potentially or giving you massive neurological problems? So obviously, if you do see even one single individual that develops this, you have to shut down the trial temporarily, investigate it further to see if that was due to the vaccine. Is it a potential side effect? Is it 1% of people, 10% of people, 50% of people, whatever the percentage is that might develop something like that. In that case, even if it's something very effective in terms of protecting you from catching COVID-19, how many people would be willing to inject themselves with this, right? So it's an important thing to keep in mind. So long story short, while we're waiting for that for a vaccine, from whether it's from Moderna, whether it's from Pfizer, or all GSK, or all the other pharmaceutical companies, on top of AstraZeneca that have been very actively working on developing one. If this becomes a protracted, a very protracted event where it takes longer than early next year or mid next year to get a vaccine, and then even if you get it and everything is fine by early to mid next year, it's also a matter of now you have to produce 7.8 billion doses of it, right? Or of one vaccine or another. Now, whether the one, for instance, that they have in Russia, whether that one's effective or not, is a big question mark. The Russians say it's effective. There's a there are very many question marks in other countries in terms of how effective that state mandatory vaccine actually is. But again, time will tell. Now, obviously, as people's incomes are very uncertain, that also increases stress and a number of other psychological disorders and complications, right? Again, just because COVID-19 has come to town, it does not mean that people are no longer, suffering from other mental disorders or many other physical disabilities as well. So that's another significant contributor to individuals' financial, hardships. So as a result, in many countries, many governments have agreed to continue some form of stimulus to help those most vulnerable of their citizens, those people that have been negatively impacted by COVID-19, by providing various subsidies, various stimulus packages. Now, many other countries have also tried to, step away from simply giving people money because in many ways it can actually be a significant disincentive from people actually seeking employment, because especially if you used to be employed only as a part-time employee, or you used to make minimum wage, or even worse, make minimum wage and only work part-time. In many cases, you would actually stand to earn a lot more if you're simply on some form of government benefit, for instance, CERB, right? And then as soon as you earn more than $1,000 a month, CERB used to be cut. But that's why we have all those new, the CRB, for example, the Canada Relief Benefit, for instance, that is going to be implemented starting September 27th of this year for that lasts for a year, and you can apply for it and you're good for about 6 months. So governments do have to provide some form of stimulus. Again, it's not people's faults that they had to shut down their businesses. It's not their fault that this has happened. So you have to provide that. At the same time, you have to make sure that the population isn't too highly, stressed and depressed. So there's this very fine balancing act of what should you shut down, what should you keep open, how much money should you be giving them. You want to give them enough that people don't have to resort to criminal activity or other forms of negative societal activity. Yet you don't want to make people complacent and simply rely on government support forever. Now, obviously, many people have talked about it, potentially this being the opening of the floodgates to eventually enable or allow people to receive some form of universal basic income. And some preliminary studies in previous years, in certain parts of Ontario, for example, in Canada, a pilot has been run since Sudbury and a few other cities, basically giving people $1,000 a month, and just as some form of UBI. And the idea is there to replace all other or most other social support systems with this universal basic income. Now, obviously, there's many pros and cons on this. So again, that's not the topic of today's session, but it's still an important thing to keep in mind. So people, right, they need to develop some new skills. Like quite a few people will have to do this. At the same time, there's increased stress because a lot of those people that are currently sitting at home not working, and that are struggling to develop those new skills, they're not lazy by default, right? They're stuck in a situation, and many of them, when think of it, back in the days when you're in high school or university or what have you, when is it easier for you to learn something new? When you have plenty of time to do so, when you're kind of studying on your own terms, or if you have someone watching over your shoulder say, do it right now, you only have this many minutes to learn this off the top of your head. So obviously in this case, what is the ticking time bomb? Well, it's the fact that people were struggling financially before COVID-19 hit, and many still are, even with the government benefits. So then it's like, okay, well, I have all this time now, but maybe you try to learn some new new skill or pick up a new skill. But depending on your abilities, depending on your age, especially, again, individuals that are older are less comfortable with online learning tools, or have less access to this type of technology, might have a really hard time relearning everything from scratch when they're in their early 60s and they were thinking that they're going to be retiring in 3-4 years from now, right? Now the question is, what's going to fill that gap, right, in the meantime? And again, government wants to be able to help those people out, but you don't want to give people too much money, because then it acts as a disincentive. And also, let's face it, the Canadian government cannot afford current support levels, right? So that's why they're rolling back the CERB, converting it into those other programs, which I've covered in a previous session. And yeah, eventually someone's going to have to pay off this debt, right? Again, a lot of people say, well, it's impossible to ever pay this off. No one's going to be able to afford this. We should just write it off. Again, there are many economic reasons why that's typically not an option, or if it is an option, it's an option that would significantly devalue the Canadian dollar, and there are many other very negative economic there's a lot of negative economic fallout of that. So the most realistic future outcome of this is, at least the government will pretend to be trying to pay down the debt and reduce the deficits eventually. Will that happen in 2021, or will we have to wait until 2025 or thereabouts? Again, time will tell, depending on how quick we are to develop a vaccine, a treatment, to what extent the second or nth wave, how bad it will impact individuals. Again, right now we're in the middle of reopening primary and secondary schools across Canada, depending on which province you're in. If you're in Quebec, for instance, Quebec has been open already for the last week and a half or so, depending on which school board you're at. And we've already seen roughly 40 or I think 50 schools actually being shut down because there have been multiple cases in those schools. I wouldn't be surprised to see quite a bit of resurgence in Ontario, BC, Alberta, in those provinces where you still have quite a few active cases. Obviously, COVID-19 doesn't just come out and get you, right? COVID-19 requires people to transmit it. So if people distance, if people are very careful, you significantly reduce the transmissibility of this. At the same time, you cannot keep people cooped up in their homes and children just with the online, or at least young children. I'm specifically thinking of grade school children. You cannot really have them sit in front of a computer for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day and learn as effectively as they would, and how would they be playing with their friends and all that social aspect. So eventually, yes, the government will have to start thinking of ways to pay off the debts incurred. How long will it take them to do so? That's up for debate. But basically, you have societal stresses here, or stresses on individuals, which is again lower income and just overall higher stress. Hopefully by getting this kids back to school, you reduce a bit of that extra stress that a parent has to deal with. Well, now I have to take care of my young children, and at the same time I have to be giving I'm online doing a live meeting or what have you with somebody else. So at least having the kids in school reduces some of that stress for people that weren't able to return back to work because they had to be taking care of their children. That will enable them to go back to work. But obviously with reopening, you also increase that potential transmission rate, unfortunately. So you have to weigh this very carefully, and there's no surefire, do it this way and it's guaranteed that it's going to work, do it the other way and it's guaranteed that it's going to fail. Everything is gray. There are many shades of gray. It's not a simple white and black cutout in terms of what is the right procedure. We're learning as we're going. And eventually, how will the government have to pay off this debt? Well, what is their easiest way of doing this, or the the government's kind of prerogative is what? To tax individuals and to provide services. Currently, they're providing a lot of services. They're providing a lot of support to municipalities. They're providing the federal government has been providing increased funding, increased funds to their provinces to deal with all the additional requirements of COVID-19 in terms of having proper PPE, having setting up a proper opening and reopening guidelines for various municipal works, for various school boards and what have you, right? Because that's obviously managed at the provincial level, but provinces don't have all the money themselves. They need supplements from the federal government typically. So eventually, where is all of this money coming from? Bank of Canada and the Canadian government doesn't have a giant gold deposit or anything like that with the Bank of Canada anymore. So it's not as if they're like, well, we have all that money, let's just sell off some of the gold, or let's dig up dig up through our giant piles of hidden money in our bank vaults. They don't have that, right? So it's all of this is borrowed against future tax revenues. And I've discussed this before, that it's likely that maybe not necessarily in this particular budget, which will hopefully be announced sometime in early October, since we have the throne speech on September 23rd. So, the 2020-2021 budget should be announced sometime in early October. So they might announce a hike in the inclusion rate for capital gains tax from from 50% basically to maybe 75% or thereabouts, compared to whatever your marginal tax rate is. But it's, again, Prime Minister Trudeau has been on the record saying that right now is not necessarily a time to hamper people with additional taxes. If and when the case numbers and deaths and all that drop significantly, and we can reopen the economy a bit more fully without seeing significant spikes in cases, probably springtime, the 2021-2022 budget is more likely to see an increase in taxes, if any. Again, this is according to most sources that I've read and most of my contacts. But again, that's all speculation. Nothing is certain. But what's for certain is that someone at some point in time will have to pay for the extra services, the extra stimulus packages, which are essential, are needed. Because if you don't provide people with that, well, what do? Well, then you have increased stress. You'll have even more increased social unrest. And if there's one thing that 2020 doesn't need more of, is more social unrest than we've already had with everything that has been going on in the world. If you're looking at hurricanes, we're still in the middle of hurricane season. Mostly the US, again, Canada doesn't really get much. We might get a bit of a rougher storm, the East Coast mostly from that, or a few extra tornadoes in Ontario or other provinces. But we're mostly sheltered from this. Again, obviously, wildfires are still a significant concern until November or thereabouts. At least we're not as badly hit, or nowhere nearly as badly hit as California is. And I'm mostly thinking Alberta wildfires. They do happen every single year. Right now, there's very few compared to California. But nonetheless, so these are unfortunately normal, quote unquote, events that tend to happen at the end of summer and throughout the fall. But on top of this, obviously, we have all the racial tensions in the U.S. that have and worldwide. Good news is that, again, Canada seems to actually be actively trying to do something about it. Whether they're doing enough or not, or they should do more, again, that's a debate for another time. But long story short, is the last thing we need right now is more people out in the street protesting because they don't have a way to support their families and the government doesn't allow them to go back to work. So you need those stimulus packages. I know a lot of people are not a fan of giving people free money while they're out working and potentially putting their lives at risk. If you're a frontline worker, or even if you're someone working at the supermarket, many that is considered a frontline worker in many cases. These increased taxes will have to pass in one way or another. Now, obviously, companies, as restrictions will be relaxed, and gradually relaxed, will have to implement new ways of dealing with COVID-19, which again, most companies have been so far quite happy allowing their employees to work remotely, for the companies and for the businesses that are able to operate remotely. But recent research from McKinsey and a few other ones as well have demonstrated that after that initial productivity bump, so the really interesting thing that happened, and again, I'll post some of these links afterwards in the video description. I forgot to include them earlier on. So some of these bumps, if you will, in productivity that happened early on, after we started the whole work from home bit, tends to sort of wean off after a certain number of months, as people do become a bit, I guess, fatigued, if you will, of just interacting with people via a computer screen, right? People need that social interaction. Humans are social creatures after all. So because of all of this, it is kind of, companies have are stuck in this, between a rock and a hard place, where a lot of them want to encourage employees to work remotely, but they also want to make sure that that initial productivity gain is not lost. So a lot of there is quite a bit of a push for companies to start reopening. And now this, I'll just post this link in the chat, and I'll post it in the description right after. So this was you might have seen this on the National, on CBC in the National yesterday. So this is a 7 minute and 34 seconds, I believe, excerpt when they were specifically talking about some of the additional precautions or extra steps that companies have started implementing in order to keep their workers safe. Because again, to bring people back, you have to make sure that people feel safe enough to go back to work. Again, if someone fears for their life, even if you're kind of dangling the carrot of, here, I'm going to pay you, they're probably not going to be willing to take that carrot if they have an alternative offered to them. So that will cost companies quite a bit of initial investment in terms of setting everything up. They might have to operate at reduced capacity depending on how big their office is, depending on how much social distancing they can implement in their specific office setup. Some companies are a lot more crammed than others. Others have plenty of space. And again, I highly encourage you to watch that video. It's after this 7 minute, very informative video. They're looking at the different implementations of this. So the cost for companies is a potential loss in productivity if this prolongs itself for indefinitely, potentially, depending on the sector, and also again the additional cost of having to operate at a reduced capacity. Now, obviously, quite a few companies are taking advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic, as I talked about in previous sessions, and for instance, shutting certain some of their offerings or curtailing some of their offerings. For instance, quite a few banks have actually not just temporarily, but have permanently shut down certain branches, which for years were underutilized compared to how much it cost the bank to actually operate those branches. And they're replacing them with ATMs, for example. So that's one way that certain jobs, for instance, those janitors, those IT support individuals, some of them might be employed and still on the payroll of the bank and just working remotely when it comes to the IT individuals, for instance, or some of the advisors or some of the tellers. But you don't need quite the same number of tellers. If you're shutting down 3 branches, you don't need every single one of the tellers for every single one of those branches to convert to online or answering a phone, for instance, right? So as a result, you can actually furlough some people or a significant portion of that. So this has sort of a long-term effect. And again, in other industries, people are more than happy to try to get their employees back to work. Now, what will this look like? Because I was talking to you about the forecast initially. So right now, these are the statistics from up until yesterday, basically. So right now, as I said, we have about 135,000 or thereabouts, between 134 and 136, depending on the data you're looking at. Specifically, if you're looking at the most recent, and this is, again, I'm sure you've seen this on the news and many other places, the John Hopkins, here, I'll just copy this, and this is what it looks like. Wikipedia has it listed here for yesterday at 134,294. That's the data that I'm using here in my so the actual data is the red line. The initial model was the orange one, and the other one, kind of pink one, is that my revised model from a few months ago. So that's one little thing to keep in mind. But so this is the one that I was telling you about before. So obviously globally we have about 28 million people really, and in the US we have about 6.4 cases, which again those are the largest cases. But now if you actually look at the numbers and you're looking at the number of new cases, again that is cumulative basically, you can actually see here that the US has had sort of a second bump. I don't want to call this a second wave because the first wave wasn't really done. It's just a second bump to the first wave. And now, yes, we've started seeing this sort of decline, but it's still, roughly, 34.25 thousand new cases. Now, the one that worries me really the most is India here, right? Because they're just starting to ramp up again. You see, because they were sort of, the number of new cases were slowly kind of slowing down. But now last week and a bit, we've seen kind of a revamped in the numbers of new cases. And now, India is close to 100,000 new cases per day, about 92,000 new cases in a day. That doesn't look great, unfortunately. And that's very worrisome. Their infrastructure is nowhere near as advanced as many other Western countries. In case they do get a lot of daily new cases, you might start seeing significant increases in number of deaths, just because those people won't have access to emergency services. So where is Canada in all of this? Well, Canada's over here, as I said, 136,615 according to John Hopkins here. And we see that, obviously this was our big bump here, and then obviously we flattened the curve and what have you. And then during the summer, it was more or less, sort of oscillating. Some days were higher, and again, for Canada, higher meant around, 770 cases in this case here. And then lower days were around 250 cases or thereabouts. Now, obviously, with schools reopening, we've seen this a few new spikes. And for instance, here 2 days ago, we had 1.4 thousand cases according to Johns Hopkins. So this remains important to monitor. It'll be really interesting what's going to happen next 2 weeks. In terms of with the reopening of schools and how that will impact cases. All right, so what are the forecasts then going forward? So this is all the way to March 12th of 2021. And as I said in my description of this video, last time I was actually in person giving one of my presentations in front of a full class of students was on March 12th in the evening of, because it was an evening class, in the evening of March 12th. And right around 7:30 p.m. or so, one of my students kind of raised their hand and said, I just got an email from the university saying that the university is going to be shut effective tomorrow morning, and all classes are canceled for the foreseeable future. So 2 days from now, so on Saturday, it'll be exactly 6 months since that evening happened. And 6 months from now, well, this is roughly what the model projects. So specifically, the model projects about 694,000 cases by then. Again, this is cumulative, and then the revised one would be just under 400,000, so about 380 or thereabouts. So now, I really hope that the number of recorded cases, especially as we're improving our testing capabilities, stay as close as possible or below the second model. But according to the latest numbers that I've looked at, unfortunately, it seems very likely that the end numbers will be between these two lines here. So this is sort of your estimate range, if you will. And why am I saying this? Well, if you were to go back, to let's say May 26th, because that's basically when you had this the significant increase in cases start to drop quite a bit. So there you go, right around there. So if I was to leave everything the same, so just take the real increase in cases that we've seen here and the projected increase in cases here, but ignoring the start points, because obviously at this point, even though here it forecasts, let's say the real rise in rate, so here it said, let's say it forecast about 300 new cases or 500 new cases. In reality, you had 500 new cases, but it's all based on, the extra significant larger number of cases that we had up here. So as a result, at this point, these three lines don't really diverge anymore. They're pretty much moving in parallel. If anything, the red one is catching up with the other two. But the original model was so far above what the actual numbers are. So if you were to actually pretend as though the model was just starting here, like you're still using the exact same forecasting in terms of what is the percentage increase, but instead of having the start numbers at this point in time be 250,000 and 450,000 respectively, you're readjusting it to be 100,000 people. Well, this is what you would get. So in this case, you can see those two models are ridiculously close together. And now here we see the bump for the last few days, right here. You see this increase? That's since schools have reopened, okay? So, yeah. So what this tells us, and also you see the model here forecast initially a second wave. You see this? It's a small one because again, it's looking at cumulative numbers. So a small second wave was forecast here. Okay, see that? And it sort of peters off. And then a third small one forecast there, roughly. So that would be right after the Christmas break. And this one was literally right after the first month. So, and starting mid to end of September, you would have this second spike based on data. All right, so the point of all of this is, so if this kind of keeps up, we'll probably have about 200,000 cases or so. So again, these are the numbers the original models forecast and what you would get there. So what do we care about the numbers? Well, it's simple. The more people are infected, the more people infect others, the more likely companies and businesses and the economy is going to be hampered to some extent. Again, hopefully we can go back to a more realistic, more normal or new normal, as people have been calling it, sooner rather, state of affairs sooner rather than later. But exactly what it will look like, again, it's very hard to say. And what really matters here is to understand that this is likely going to be a protracted thing. So the most likely outcome is that within the next 3 years, you will have one or multiple vaccines that will be available in significant enough numbers to actually have an impact. And or people will start developing sufficient immunity. Right now, it's still a very, very small fraction of the population that has been confirmed to have had COVID. Some people have already been confirmed to be able to be reinfected by COVID. So that's another thing we are not certain of yet. If you just catch it, how long you'll be immune for. If it turns out that this thing mutates quickly enough and you're not really that immune, even if you have caught it and you can just recatch it 4, 5, 6 months later, then it also means that the vaccine is likely going to be something that you'll have to probably get once or twice a year, the same way that you're getting you're getting a flu vaccine, or you're able to get a flu vaccine once a year. So there's a good chance that you'll have to be doing that with COVID-19 going forward for the foreseeable future. But hopefully within 3 years or so from now, we'll see most of the economy resume some form of normalcy. And obviously, this doesn't mean everything is going to stay the way it is right now for the next 3 years. No, no, no. It'll just very gradually, very slowly reopen. What my hopes are, based on epidemiological data, based on how these things progress, that it's quite likely that it'll take a few waves of this and a few years of this. So hopefully 3 years, that's my hopeful scenario, that we'll get back to something resembling the old normal. To get something really close to the old normal, where you could basically just get up one morning and say, hey, you know what, today, I have the day off, I'm gonna just hop on in a short flight and just fly to the next city or next country over and just spend the afternoon and come back again. Most people cannot afford to do that on a regular basis, but if you wanted to and had the money, you could do it, right? Same thing with an impromptu visit, or you wanted to surprise a friend that lived across the border. You didn't have to, well, is the US border open, or is the whatever country border that you're across opening, and can I actually go and visit my in-laws, or can I actually go and visit my old high school buddy that happens to live in New York State right now, and well, I'm stuck in Montreal because I'm not allowed to cross the border, right? So that will be between 5 and 10 years. So if we're to get to that norm, I would say, and again, this is not me trying to be scaremongering, this is not me trying to be pessimistic, it's just a lot of people still think COVID is no big deal, still think it's a hoax. Some even think ridiculous things, that's, it was some form of conspiracy made by Bill Gates or what have you, when if you're looking at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the main thing they've been working on is to provide vaccines and various forms of medication to third world nations for, a couple of decades at this point, right? So beyond, it's beyond ridiculous. But anyway, that's the problem with having pretty much anyone being able to share their opinion freely online, is that unfortunately, when some people have very extreme opinions and there's no filter, those extreme opinions find themselves and they just feed off each other. And unfortunately, when those opinions diverge from the norm, and it also has a negative impact on everyone's health, that's when it becomes dangerous. So you don't want to stifle personal opinion, and you don't want to stifle freedom of speech, but at the same time, you have to be very careful that it doesn't kind of go into messing the progress up that we've been all working so hard, or most of us working really hard to do, in terms of getting the economy back on track and taking care of all these things. All right, so just to wrap up, what are some of the main takeaways here? Well, again, COVID-19 is likely to going to be sticking around for some time. In one form or another, I wouldn't be surprised if COVID-19 just becomes part of the seasonal flu/cold mix or cocktail of viruses that come every single year. The really disconcerting thing with COVID-19 right now is that it still has a very high transmission rate, that R0 that they're talking about, right? That transmission rate is very, very high compared to regular corona and rhinoviruses, which are responsible for the common cold, or even the influenza virus, which is responsible for the various flus that we've had over the years. So it's a lot easier to transmit. You have that very long incubation period, so you don't know if you have it or not. Some people are asymptomatic, whereas when you get a cold, you have a cold. You're not feeling great. And when you have the flu, when you have a real flu, you're sick. Okay, it's very obvious you're contagious and you're not feeling great, and you don't want to be anywhere near anyone because you're not feeling good. Whereas with COVID-19, you might be feeling perfectly fine, and yet able to infect others. So because of this, and then on top of that, you're adding people that don't believe it's real, it'll be very difficult for countries and companies to convince people that their vaccines are safe and they're not trying to brainwash them or some whatever other ridiculous conspiracy theories are out there, right? So the more of those you hear, the harder it'll be for people to say, oh, okay, now this company has come up with a vaccine. Will you take it or not, right? For instance, I'd be uncomfortable right now taking the one in Russia because I don't think it has been tested enough. I'm very happy that AstraZeneca has put their trials on hold, because that kind of shows you that, you know what, they're taking safety seriously, right? So if something is unsafe, they're going to be pausing the trials, which is very normal. It's standard procedure for any vaccine or any medication. Whenever you're developing new medication, whether it's diabetes medication, whether it's a cancer drug or what have you, if you see a significant negative reaction, even if it's only in a handful of patients, you'll pause it. You'll pause the trial and making sure that that reaction was actually due or caused by the vaccine, and it wasn't just something that happened to randomly occur, right? So yeah, there may also be long-term consequences, unfortunately, of COVID-19. So this, again, the jury's still out on this. But recently, I've been looking at quite a few articles discussing this. So here I'm going to just post these 3 links in rapid succession. I'm just going to show them to you really quickly. So here's one. So this is a publication from, I believe this one was in April. No, sorry, this one was on July 11th of this year, right? So they're looking at this, the collateral damage, as they call it, so assessing the collateral damage of the novel coronavirus, a call to action for post-COVID-19 era. So they're looking at all the repercussions of COVID-19, and some additional. So this one here came out in June. Let me just copy that one as well for those of you that are interested. Here you go. And again, I'll post a link to all of these in the description after this. So the emergence of severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, or SARS-CoV-2 virus, so that's the name of the virus, which causes the coronavirus disease, or COVID-19, right, has rapidly grown into a worldwide pandemic ever since first being described in Wuhan, China at the end of 2019. At the time of writing, so this one was published in June, but sorry, it was published on April 16th. The other one was June. The rapid spread of the virus throughout the world has resulted in over 1.6 million infections and over 95,000 deaths worldwide. Now, obviously, today, so again, this is not to scaremonger or anything, but these are the stats, and it's important to be aware of these stats. To this day, right, that was April 16th, we had 95,000 deaths. Right now, we have almost 10 times as many, 905,000, and it doesn't show any form of it. It's not relenting right now, right? So if anything, you'll see many more of these deaths. And this happened in about half a year of it actually, being very active in terms of spreading across the population. Because yes, it's been around since late 2019, but it was, very few people were infected. So you can't really account for, or look at how many people has it killed in the first 2 months of its existence, because it wasn't really infecting anyone. There were very few people there. So just as a benchmark, your average flu season globally kills between about 250 to about 750,000 people in a really, really bad year. So, and that's during an entire 365 days of the year, right? So this is for all flus combined, not just one flu vaccine, one flu virus, sorry. So again, there are many strains of influenza that are present every year. Some are a lot more deadly than others, and many will be, multiple will be active each year, and some will be more active in the southern hemisphere, some will be more active in the northern hemisphere as we're switching, between winter and summer between the hemispheres. So that's, so this thing is basically 33% worse than the worst normal flu season has been in that is in a year, but within a half a year. So it's basically about 3 times as deadly, at least, as the regular flu. And now you might say, well, but we don't shut down the economy for the flu. So why the heck should we be shutting down the economy for COVID-19? Because these stats, these numbers, the 905,000 people, that's despite us shutting down the economy globally. Imagine how many people would have died had we not done anything. That's the problem, right, with this. So the main takeaway that from here, the thing that you really should be looking at is given the ferocity and devastating effects on healthcare systems abroad, Australia has implemented a series of measures. So again, here they're talking about the increase in cases. And then finally, this is the more concerning one, I think. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's basically it's being referred to as post-COVID syndrome or post-COVID-19 chronic symptoms, which has been defined as post-COVID syndrome. So there have been a number of there've been a couple of studies. One, I believe, was from Germany, and the other one from South Korea, looking at people that have had COVID-19 and have been free of COVID-19 for a number of months. And they looked at, they've been taking various blood samples, and they're looked at, how they're feeling and so on and so forth. And looked at x-rays of their lungs, for example. And it turns out that in about 78 to 80% of cases, people, even a few months after being COVID-free, still had significant and noticeable lesions on their lungs, so very similar to what you would see in someone having had tuberculosis. Have had various other respiratory issues that, people that never had asthma before, for example, people that never had any form of problems in terms of pneumonia or anything like that, and now are much more susceptible to just catching it or not being able to breathe properly, seeing an increase in difficulty breathing, in changes in their overall response to blood pressure medication, for instance. So again, if you have high blood pressure, it's I think your mortality rate increases like by threefold with COVID-19. So having high blood pressure, having a high BMI, they're very, very high risk. It's very high risk when it comes to COVID-19 and actually catching the disease and how it progresses. And there was, again, usually I'm not the greatest fan of this. This is just a nice summary here from Yahoo. I highly advise that, recommend that you read this. So this specifically here looks at the post-COVID-19 recovery. So yeah, this sample study. So here they're just summarizing what I just told you. 80% of healthy people facing heart problems post-COVID. So lifelong disease may result in multiple organ disability. So you might actually literally have people that after having caught COVID-19, they might be significantly more likely and significantly more susceptible to catching other things for the rest of their lives, even if they're never ever exposed to COVID-19 ever again. So the long-term financial and economic costs of COVID-19 could be significantly greater than merely, I'm missing a month of work, or I'm stuck, with the kids home because the school had to shut down for the next 2 weeks because they had a second wave in the school or what have you. So these are things that, again, there's no point in panicking about it, but it's important to be aware of. So don't panic, but instead focus on the things that you can control. With anything in life, having a sense of no control or loss of control, it can be very detrimental to your physical and psychological health. So it might seem overwhelming. Yeah, maybe tune out the news. There's no point in listening to COVID stats every single day. It can be quite depressing pretty quickly. But it can be very helpful to focus on things that you're able to control. Make your own schedule if you're able to do so. Go for a walk, work out a bit. Like they sound like platitudes, but they actually work, right? Give some structure to your day. It'll be a lot easier to focus on things. And then finally, please do follow the advice of healthcare practitioners. They're not out to get you, right? They're there to help you. And you make both your own lives and their lives a lot easier if you simply comply with the current guidelines. And yes, the guidelines change. Guess why? Why? Because they're learning as they're going. This is a new form of coronavirus. As a result, they're kind of trying to figure out what works, what doesn't. It's not a slam dunk. No one knows for sure what's going to be effective and what won't be. Just again, do be aware that, again, I don't want to be negative, but it's highly unlikely that we're not going to see a couple of waves of this. Likely right now, as schools restart and as the flu and cold season restarts, it's very likely we'll see a second spike in Canada and worldwide, really most countries, on the northern hemisphere, right? At least we'll see this second wave. And then I would be very impressed if we don't see at least a third wave right after the holidays. So my forecast is at least 2 waves this winter. Hopefully we'll manage to maintain the cases to about 500 a day or thereabouts. Maybe close to 1,000 at the peak of those second and third waves, but we will see. And that's assuming people abide by the rules and regulations. Otherwise, it has the potential of being much worse. And then, hopefully we'll have some treatments and whatnot within a not too distant future and get something closer to a normal within the next 2 to 3 years. And then very close to normal, like what we used to have, most likely 5 to 10 from now. It might sound a bit depressing, but given how easy this thing spreads, given how much reluctance there is by people to follow the advice, given how many people will outright refuse to take and be vaccinated when the vaccine will eventually come. Again, if people are protesting wearing masks right now, having to wear masks in public, do you really think that those people will be willing to get the vaccine once said vaccine comes up? And I'd be amazed if said vaccine doesn't have some side effects for a certain percentage of the population. It's impossible for any drug, any medication to have 0% and zero interaction with any other medication. Again, keep in mind, people are very different, right? Someone who is, younger, healthier, and versus someone who's same age, but they might have other, they might be morbidly obese, or they might have, they might be taking 5 other medications. Maybe the vaccine is 100% safe by itself, but if you mix it in with that particular cocktail of 5 other medications in that particular dosage, you're giving it to this particular person, given their BMI, given the time of day you're giving it to them, maybe that person has an adverse reaction. And you only take a handful of people having significant, severe complications from the vaccine once it's approved to make people that were on the fence whether to take it or not to say, I'll never take this thing, or I'll rather take my chances with COVID. And because of that, I really don't see how this thing is going to just disappear by next summer, right? I hope it will. I honestly, I'm done with COVID. If tomorrow it'll go away, I'd be more than happy. But there's wishful thinking and there's reality. So anyway, I hope this was at least generally useful to you. And keep safe, everyone, and look for decent data, decent information. There's no point in scaremongering. There's no point in freaking out. A lot of it is just common sense. Everyone be safe out there. And next week I'll be talking about the housing stats for August of this year, which the preliminary data suggests that people have really lost their minds in Canada, at least, in terms of how much they've been pushing house prices up because of this fear of missing out, because there was no real spring marketing. Yeah. So we'll talk about that next Thursday. In the meantime, thank you so much for stopping by today. And I'll see you next week. Take care. Have a good one.